one of the worst problems we have in the country are bad voter registration lists. Lists that are still filled with people who have died, people who've moved to other states, people who are not U.S. citizens on the voter rolls.
Keeping our republic is on the line, and it requires patriots with great passion, dedication, and eternal vigilance to preserve our freedoms. Jenny Beth Martin is the co-founder of Tea Party Patriots. She is an author, a filmmaker, and one of Time magazine's most influential people in the world. But the title she is most proud of is mom to her boy-girl twins. She has been at the forefront, fighting to protect America's core principles for more than a decade. Welcome to the Jenny Beth Show.
Today we're joined by Hans von Spakovsky, who is a longtime friend of mine. He is also the senior legal fellow or a senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation and the chairman of the Public Interest Legal Foundation. Hans, I'm so glad to have you with me today.
Well, it's really nice to talk to you again, Jenny.
We have been working on election issues the whole time we've known each other.
We have.
And we've been working on election integrity issues specifically since, I've been working on it with you since the year 2000 when we both were deployed down to Florida for the recount in Bush v. Gore.
Yeah, Jenny Beth, that's something I still tell my kids about, the fact that I went down there to help watch them do the recount in the Al Gore, George Bush election.
Yeah, it was pretty crazy. I had my go bag packed and finally got that call from BJ Van Gundy, I think at like 3:00 in the morning. You need to be ready. You need to leave now because we need to be at an airport at 5:00 in the morning or something crazy like that.
No, that's right. And, I actually at home have one of the punch card voting machines that caused such a huge controversy in Florida, and which, of course, no one uses in the country anymore. One of these days I may give it to the Smithsonian.
Wow, you should. The Smithsonian should have that, and we definitely should not be using those. I think there are some other machines we probably shouldn't be using that we are using right now, but that's not what we're here to talk about today. So explain to the audience what your experience is with election integrity and explain what your credentials are.
I've served on 2 county election boards. One in Georgia, one in Virginia. In both times, it was the largest county in the state, and it was the county election board in charge of not only processing everyone getting registered to vote, but running the polls on election day. I also spent several years at the U.S. Justice Department in the Civil Rights Division, where I was responsible for enforcement of our federal voting rights laws. I then went over to the Federal Election Commission. For 2 years, Federal Election Commission enforces our laws on the financing of federal campaigns, both the presidential campaign and congressional campaigns. And then I went over to the Heritage Foundation, where I am actually the manager of our election law reform initiative. And that's a long-time project we've been working on to convince states to improve the integrity and security of their election process.
Wow, you just know so much about elections, and you really, when you're talking about elections, you're not just talking in theory because you actually have done it. Like you were on the election board in Fulton County, Georgia, and you understand the process inside and out. And not only that, you also understand it from the viewpoint of an activist because you used to be the county party chairman for the Republican Party in Fulton County, Georgia as well.
No, that's right. And I have found that there's a lot of academic professors these days who are constantly saying, well, we ought to be doing this and we ought to be doing that. And most of them have absolutely no experience in the practical problems of, for example, running an entire county of polling places on election day.
Yeah, and the theory sounds good in a very sterile classroom environment, but what happens on the ground in election day is very far from a sterile environment.
No, it's very true. And that has also led to huge amounts of, we talk about the lawfare used against President Trump, but there's been a huge amount of lawfare in the election reform area also, because every time states have tried to improve things, for example, most basically putting in a voter ID law, which almost all voters think is a good idea, they face huge fights in the courts from all these groups on left side of the political aisle, unfortunately, who are opponents of basic reforms like voter ID.
And it's mind-boggling
It
because
is.
most people agree that we should have voter ID. They want their vote to count and not be canceled out by an illegal or improper vote. And they understand they can get an ID. It's not impossible to get an ID in America.
Yeah, it's a really interesting issue because Americans are pretty deeply divided on a lot of issues.
Right.
But when it comes to, for example, having to show photo ID when you vote, Americans overwhelmingly agree. I mean, the last poll I saw on this was over 80% of Americans. And it's a majority of, it don't matter whether people are Republicans, Democrats, Independents, doesn't matter their race or ethnic background. A majority of all voters say, well, that's just common sense.
Right. And it is. And even like proving citizenship to register to vote. Americans agree on this as well.
Right.
They want only Americans deciding the outcome of American elections.
Yeah, it's true. But the left is just uniformly against this. I was nominated by George Bush to be a commissioner on the Federal Election Commission. And there was a particular senator, Democratic senator, who put a hold on my nomination, a guy named Barack Obama. And why?
I have heard of him.
He wrote an op-ed going after me because I had proposed that voters should have to show an ID to vote.
Wow. And then it explains a lot, doesn't it?
It does.
He was a
yes.
senator, became the president, and that is what we've been up against when it comes to the kind of common sense reform that we want with election
Right.
laws.
Right.
So, looking at the landscape of election integrity, what do you think are the most pressing problems that need to be solved? And what do you think that the Trump administration can do versus what should be left to states to do?
Look, under the Constitution, states have the primary responsibility to run elections, and that's the way it's been. And, the problem with folks who say, well, the federal government ought to come in and nationalize this and take it over and run it is for everything good that Congress could do, they could do something bad. And the best example of that was back when Nancy Pelosi was still in control of the House. They came up with this huge bill, 800 pages, that would have nationalized the election process, taken it away from the states. And one of the most priority things in that bill was to void out all voter ID laws. That shows the problem. What the federal government ought to be doing is helping and assisting the states to do a good job. For example, one of the worst problems we have in the country are bad voter registration lists. Lists that are still filled with people who have died, people who've moved to other states, people who are not U.S. citizens on the voter rolls. And that's an area where the federal government can assist the states. I mean, for example, for years, the Department of Homeland Security has put up all these bureaucratic obstacles to make it difficult for states to have any access to what they call the SAVE database. This is a database of aliens who are in the U.S., those who are here legally and those who are here illegally, but at some point were caught and processed and a record was created. Well, state election officials ought to be able to access that so they can verify the citizenship status of people who are registered to vote. That's one of the things the federal government ought to immediately help them. Another one is the Social Security Administration has a master death index. They try to keep track of people who die all over the country. They should be giving access without any charge to state election officials so they can find people who perhaps were registered to vote in Georgia but died in California, because Georgia's not going to find out about that unless they do it. That's the kind of assistance that can be given by the federal government to help the states rather than taking over administration of elections. Anybody who thinks that the federal government would do a good job if they were running our polling places, come on, that's not gonna. That would not happen.
Well, I think we're seeing with DOJ that there are all sorts of problems in the federal government
Right.
with it trying to run just about anything.
Right.
There are all sorts of errors. One of the things you just mentioned about the voter databases and keeping those up to date.
Right.
I think there should be some way that, and maybe you disagree with this, so and it's fine if you do, you can explain why, that through the motor voter law, when you go to get your driver's license, you can register to vote. And there's a
Right.
federal law that allows for that. I think that law should be updated so that if you're going to get your driver's license and you're changing your address, it should automatically change the address of your voter registration. And if you move out of a state, it should automatically cancel your old registration, just like it cancels your old license.
Oh, I agree. In fact, I wrote a heritage paper about this last year that said exactly that. And a lot of people don't realize it, but most of the states are a member of a National Association of State Driver's License Departments. And they actually have a computer network that does exactly what you're talking about for driver's licenses. If you go and get your driver's license in one of the states that is a member of this network, they will automatically notify the state where you used to have your driver's license. And the states are not using that system to also get current voter registration information, and they should.
And it's crazy that they're not doing this.
Right.
It becomes onerous on the citizen, and it puts the citizen in a situation where they think they've taken care of it, and
Right.
they don't realize that they haven't.
Right.
Because you go to the place where you are registering to vote and you're getting your driver's license, and that same place cancels out your old license. They'll
Right.
clip it or tear it up or do whatever they do. So the old one is canceled, and they give you a new one, and at the same time they're registering you to vote. And it would make it makes logical sense that the citizen thinks, okay, they canceled my driver's license, or going
Right.
to cancel my voter registration. But instead, to change your voter registration, you've got to reach out to your old election office, get some sort of paperwork, fill it out, oftentimes with your driver's license number that now has been shredded and you may not even know what
Right.
the number is. It's just, it doesn't make sense. It makes no sense at all.
No, but that's you and I both know that's one of the problems is often things that are just common sense just aren't getting done. I mean, I'll give you another example of something that would be
Please.
a great help, and not just in the voting area, but for other issues too. And that is, every state in the country ought to change their driver's license so that it says prominently on the front of the driver's license whether you are a U.S. citizen or not. If you are in every state, if you're in the U.S. legally as an alien, you can get a driver's license. Unfortunately, there's about a dozen and a half states that also provide a license to aliens who are here illegally. It ought to say on the license whether you're a citizen or not. Not only would that help in the voter registration area, but it would also help, for example, states pay out a lot in public assistance, welfare. Well, the requirements of federal welfare laws are that in order to get welfare benefits, you have to be a citizen. Well, if that kind of information was on your driver's license, that would make it easier for states to ensure that they are not paying out monies that they shouldn't be.
So have you, in your work, either with Public Interest Legal Foundation or the Heritage Foundation, been working with the new administration on ways that they can improve the election and the election system?
Well, not directly, but I've been writing about things that I think they ought to be doing. And for example, I've recommended them that they immediately drop and throw out of court all of the meritless lawsuits that the prior administration filed against election reforms. Georgia is a good example of that. Remember when Georgia passed its big
right.
reform bill back in 2021, the one that so angered Joe Biden that he went down and gave a speech called it Jim Crow 2.0, which of course was not true. The states had record registration and turnout with these good reforms. The Justice Department filed a lawsuit against it, claiming it was discriminatory, which it isn't. that case needs to be dismissed. There are other cases like that. The administration has been acting. One of the other just bizarre lawsuits that the Biden administration filed is, Jenny Beth, you'll recall that prior to the last November's election, Virginia announced that it had been checking its statewide voter registration list against its DMV list. And they had found over 6,000 aliens. Now, these are people here legally, but 6,000 aliens who had a driver's license in Virginia and were also registered to vote. So they said, we're taking them off the rolls. The Justice Department, under Merrick Garland, sued Virginia and said, you can't do that. You can't take these aliens off the rolls. The Justice Department, under Pam Bondi, has just thrown out that lawsuit.
And how could they even say that was violating a civil right? They
were claiming it violated the National Voter Registration Act because it was done within 90 days of the election, but that was a complete misinterpretation of the law.
What other suits should be thrown out?
There have been redistricting cases that I think have where they've taken the wrong position. But the other thing they need to do is they need to file lawsuits.
Okay.
And the best example of that, I would say, is the state of California. One of the things is the National Voter Registration Act. That's what everybody calls motor voter.
Mm-hmm.
And the Help America Vote Act, that was passed in 2002 after our experiences in Florida. Both of those laws require states to maintain accurate voter rolls. California is probably the worst state in the country in terms of not doing the things they ought to be doing to keep their voter rolls current. And the Justice Department has never gone after them to enforce it. The Obama administration refused to do it. The Biden administration didn't do it. And they need to file a lawsuit against California under the National Voter Registration Act over the refusal of the state to clean up its voter rolls. You may recall, how bad is it? Remember, Judicial Watch filed suit against just Los Angeles a couple of years ago, and in order to settle it, Los Angeles finally agreed to take, I think, over 1.5 million individuals off the voter rolls who were no longer eligible. They were just leaving them on there.
1.5 million.
1.5 million, right.
In Virginia, when you're talking about 6,000, I was thinking that's enough to sway a really close election. 1.5 million. I'm not saying that they are all voting, but it does wind up. That's just insane.
It creates the risk that someone will use that registration address to vote, and we've seen that happen.
And what are the other things you think the Trump administration should be working on?
Well, I'm going to give you two other basic ones,
mm-hmm.
which are kind of interesting, and unfortunately, no prior administration has done this. There are 93 U.S. attorneys across the country, right, in 93 judicial districts. Georgia, for example, I think has three districts. Anyway, when U.S. attorneys' offices engage in criminal prosecutions, where do you think they get their list of potential jury members? From state election officials, right? And one thing they're not doing is when they call people for jury duty in these federal court cases, if somebody says, I'm actually not a U.S. citizen, they're excused from jury duty.
Right.
What the U.S. attorneys are not doing is then going back to the election officials where they got that list and saying, that person whose name you sent us, who's registered to vote, they're not a U.S. citizen. That every single U.S. attorney in all 93 of these districts ought to be sending that kind of information back to election officials so that they can be taken off the list. And then the other thing that U.S. attorneys should do is then say to the state election officials, send me that person's file and investigate it, because it is a felony under federal law for an alien to register and or vote in this country. And none of those cases are being investigated by any U.S. attorney's office anywhere in the country. The other thing that they ought to be doing that has never been done is if you look at the application that people fill out when they want to become a citizen, Part 9 of that form says, have you ever registered or voted in any U.S. election? And if someone answers yes, what does the Department of Homeland Security do about it these days? They don't do anything about it. Every one of those files ought to be sent by the Department of Homeland Security over to where? The Department of Justice, so they can investigate that alien and potentially prosecute them for illegally registering or voting in U.S. elections.
Why would they fill out that form if they know that there could be consequences to it?
Because at the moment, there are no consequences. Not only has DHS not been doing anything about it, but DHS hasn't been using that to deny citizenship. And it's riskier to lie on that form, because if you get caught lying, then they might actually do something about that.
I think that they could wind up being registered without even realizing that they were registered or knowing,
Yes.
because especially in the last 4 years, the way that the Biden administration had a whole of government approach to voter registration,
That's right.
you could go to the hospital, be in the middle of some emergency in the emergency room in the hospital, and be given a stack of papers or forms online, and you're just filling it out because you're not completely paying attention at that point. You're dealing with an actual medical emergency, and part of the paperwork there in many hospitals around the country was actually a voter registration form.
No, in fact, the Public Interest Legal Foundation, which does a lot of work in obtaining voter registration records, has found many situations like that where, in fact, the alien, often at DMV offices, when they would get to the question on the voter registration form that says, are you a U.S. citizen, they would answer no, and election officials would register them anyway. Those are situations where it's not the alien's fault that it happened, and that's not a situation that I think should be prosecuted. But when folks lie and claim they're a U.S. citizen when they're not, those are the cases that do need to get prosecuted.
Right, and that makes sense. And then they need to be cleaned up if they're non-citizens.
Right.
We need to go through and say, did they fill out that form and say they're a non-citizen? Are they still a non-citizen? If they are, they need to be removed from the rolls. I mean, these are...
Yeah. I mean, those are just basic things that need to be done. Now, look, one other thing that needs to happen is to make this whole situation cleaner is, Congress is working on potentially trying to pass a new bill called the SAVE Act. And this is a law that would actually require states to get proof of citizenship when people register to vote. And that is something that does need to get done.
Yes, and I've been working very heavily on that and want to see it get all the way passed and passed through Congress and signed into law.
Yeah, and we should mention the last Congress, it did make it through the House and then got filibustered by Democrats in the Senate.
we just have to attach it to something that Democrats want so that Democrats will vote for it.
Right, but that's... Think about that, Jenny Beth, that you have one political party who is against anything that would prevent people who aren't U.S. citizens from registering, voting, or getting caught. It's just astonishing to me. And what's interesting to me about that is that does not match their constituency.
Not even a little bit.
The
majority, the super majority, regardless of political party, want to ensure that it's only citizens voting.
That's a clear example where the leadership of one particular political party is not reflecting what their voters and their constituency wants them to do.
Yeah, they're just playing political games at that point for pure raw political power. It's completely wrong. And I want to see that passed. I want to see that passed very, very badly. I also haven't seen legislation yet to clean up the motor voter law with the driver's license, the way we were talking about. I really need to go back and talk to some congressmen and senators and see if they can get their staff to write a bill to do that, sort of like what just happened with the SAVE Act in the last Congress. And what I find interesting, Hans, with the things that you're talking about right now that the Trump administration can do, most of it, the SAVE Act is a different story, but most of it doesn't even require congressional action.
Right.
It is within the executive branch to be able to do that already.
No, that is true. And the reason for that is that, I mean, for example, what I was talking about with the requirement in the National Voter Registration Act that requires states to maintain clean voter rolls. That the NVRA, that was the first bill signed by Bill Clinton. For the 8 years of the Clinton administration, the Justice Department refused to enforce that provision. When George Bush came in after beating Al Gore, I actually went to work at the Justice Department, and we filed the first cases ever to enforce that provision. We actually filed 2 cases, one against Indiana, one against Missouri, which at the time, one state was a Republican state, one state was a Democratic state. When the Obama administration came in, the Missouri case was still going on. What do you think was the first thing that the Obama administration did when they got control of the Justice Department?
They dropped those
They
cases.
dropped the case. They dropped the case against a state that we were suing to try to make sure they had accurate voter rolls.
When was the bill passed initially? What year was it signed into law?
The NVRA,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, 92.
So it was passed into law by a Democrat Senate and a Democrat Congress.
Right.
And signed by a Democrat president. It's not like this was a Republican bill
right.
that the Justice Department was working against. They were working against what their own party just did in Congress.
Right. But the part about having clean voter rolls, successive Democratic administrations did not want to enforce that provision, which just is that ought to upset Americans. I don't care which political party you're affiliated with.
Well, and the rules are a mess. And when citizens try to go before their local voter or election board to get them updated, a lot of times they run into a lot of resistance to be able to do that. And I don't want you to be able to just willy-nilly remove people from the rolls, but if you are coming in and saying, this person no longer lives at this address, and the people who live at this address have signed an affidavit saying that person does not live here, at what point do you remove them? Why do you continue to allow that to stand? It makes no logical sense.
No, it doesn't. Although I have to tell you, on this issue, opponents of election reforms are constantly raising these claims against, oh my gosh, if you try to clean up your rolls, you're going to purge. That's the word like they used to. You're going to purge people and going to take away their ability to vote. That is an absolute lie. And you know why? Because part of the Help America Vote Act in 2002 was a requirement putting in what they call provisional ballots. So even if a local election official makes a mistake, they take somebody off the rolls because they believe that registered voter moved to a different state, that person is not going to be kept from voting. If they show up at their polling place and the election official says, you're not on the list, if the voter says, hey, I'm eligible, I registered to vote, they have to be handed a provisional ballot under federal law. Election officials have to investigate the circumstances, and if they made a mistake, the vote has to be counted. So all these claims that cleaning up voter rolls will lead to large numbers of people being denied the ability to vote, that's an absolute lie.
It is. It is a lie, but the lie sometimes spreads faster than the truth.
Right.
And the lie is scary. So people don't want to be afraid. The scary thing will trump the things that make sense and are calm and reassuring every single time. One of the things that they're doing right now They're talking about how if the SAVE Act passes, then women won't be able to prove that they are citizens somehow. How do they think that we're? What do they think? Like we don't know how to maintain our name,
Well,
and
you
and
know,
we have to prove our name to get your new driver's license after you're married or after you're divorced. You have to have certain paperwork for that, including your birth certificate and your marriage certificate, possibly your divorce certificate. And then the same goes for the Social Security Administration with changing your name. The same goes with the passport office. And you think we can do all of those, but somehow when it comes to registering to vote, we lost our brain cells?
well, let me tell you, remember 20 years ago when Georgia passed one of the first photo ID laws in the country requiring you to show an ID when you vote, they used that exact same claim. That claim was used not just in Georgia, but in other states where they were putting ID requirements and saying, oh, married women wouldn't be able to meet this requirement. It was, of course, completely untrue and not a problem. Plus, I should mention that the SAVE Act actually has a provision in it. It has a list of things you can use to prove your citizenship, but then it has a special provision that says that every state has to set up a special process and procedure so that if there is a discrepancy, basically between your current name and whatever you use to prove your citizenship, you can present that documentation.
Right.
So that takes care of the problem.
It does. It solves the problem right there for it. They're using scare tactics to try to galvanize people to take action, and they're lies, just like what you were describing before. It's just lies.
Right.
Honestly, it's
particularly
insulting.
Particularly for immigrants, because listen, I can say this: I'm first generation American. Okay, my mother was German, my father was Russian. They became U.S. citizens. And do you know what the most precious document was that they held and they had in a very special place in our house? It was their naturalization documents. They would have had no problems whatsoever proving their citizenship in order to be able to vote. And you talk to any legal immigrant to this country who's been naturalized, every single one of them will immediately have the documents necessary to do that.
And almost everyone has a birth certificate, and if you don't, you can go get one. It isn't hard to get them. It isn't. You can go to, I think there's a singular website where you can go at this point.
There is an internet web service now. I used it.
Yes, I had to use it for my
ago.
kids. Yeah. So you can do that. You don't have to go back to your original county and go through the board of registrars or whatever it may be called to handle figuring that out any longer. There's a service that does it for a pretty low fee. So it's just some of what they say. It's absolutely insulting.
Yeah, no, it is. But that is an issue. It's something that's got to be fixed. Eventually, I mean, the SAVE Act is most important. But at some point, it's also important for Congress to try to fix the apportionment problem, which is another issue. After every census, every state is told how many members of the U.S. House they get. And unfortunately, we now have such a huge number of people who are not citizens in this country, both legal and illegal. They're included in that formula. So what that means is that some states that don't have large alien populations get cheated out of representation in the U.S. House, and states like California California has the largest number of aliens of any state in the country. They probably would lose 4 or 5 congressional seats if apportionment was based on citizen population, which is what it ought to be.
And can you back up why it should be that way? How is it constitutional to say that? Because some people would say, oh, no, it's not constitutional.
Because individuals who are not U.S. citizens have no right to participate in our political process. They can't run for office. They're not allowed to vote. In fact, it's a felony if they run for vote. So why should they be able to distort political representation by being included in apportionment?
I think they should not.
Right.
So So, Hans, what are the things that you think that people should do individually to help make a difference when it comes to election integrity?
Two things. First of all, as we talked about at the beginning, I sat on 2 different county election boards. Okay, our meetings were all public, and members of the public almost never showed up at our meetings. I know it's a little bit of a pain, but if it's once a month, once every 2 months, members of the public who are interested in election integrity should show up at the meeting of their county election board and be prepared to ask questions. Ask questions, try to get answers on what they're doing for basic requirements, like what do they do to make sure that the voter rolls are clean and accurate. The other thing they should do is talk to whoever is their local representative in the state legislature. Take a look and make sure, does your state, for example, have a voter ID law? If it doesn't, talk to your state legislator and say, why aren't we implementing and passing something like that? I would tell folks that if they want to know how their state is doing or what their state's lacking, they can go to the website of the Heritage Foundation where I work, heritage.org. We have a thing there called our Election Integrity Scorecard. Mm-hmm. And we have a complete analysis of every single state, 50 different criteria. You can pull up your state and it'll tell you does the state have an ID law? If the state has an ID law, does it only apply to in-person voting or does it also cover absentee ballots? What does your state do to clean up its voter rolls? Do they do the most basic step, compare the statewide list to your driver's license list to find people who've moved out of state? You can look through that list and figure out what is it your state is not doing, and you can use that to talk to your state legislator and persuade them that they ought to be working on that.
Very good. Well, Hans, how can people follow your work and keep up to date with what you're doing?
They can go to heritage.org. Even when I write elsewhere, and I do that a lot, Heritage will republish it. And I also publish a lot at the Daily Signal, which is the electronic newspaper of the Heritage Foundation.
And are you on social media?
I am at H. von Spakovsky.
We'll put that. You want to spell it in case people are listening?
It's HVONSPAKOVSKY. And I don't know why that's so hard. It's a typical name for somebody from Alabama like me.
It is. It's perfectly normal for Alabamians to have that.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us today, and I really appreciate it. And I think that people have learned a lot. Most especially, there's a lot that the Trump administration can do that we'd like to see it do. I'm sure they're working on it, especially as Pam Bondi really gets her feet under her and hits the ground running. She's already hit the ground running, but continues.
Yeah, we're only a month.
Yeah, we're only a month in. It's a month in, so. That we're going to see a lot of these changes happen. And it's very exciting. We live in such exciting times right now.
We certainly do, and it's been great to talk to you guys.
Thank you so much, Hans.
The Jenny Beth Show is hosted by Jenny Beth Martin, produced by Kevin Mooneyhan, and directed by Luke Livingston. The Jenny Beth Show is a production of Tea Party Patriots Action. For more information, visit teapartypatriots.org.
If you like this episode, let me know by hitting the like button or leaving a comment or a 5-star review. And if you want to be the first to know every time we drop a new episode, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications for whichever platform you're listening on. If you do these simple things, it will help the podcast grow, and I'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much.